Well, welcome. This is the 83rd episode of Women on Wealth. I'm Julina Ogilvie, and the title for today is Key Concepts for Retirement Planning. And I love this because as unique as we all are in our financial endeavors, I have yet to really meet anyone that doesn't think about their retirement future. So this is a hot topic, a very broad topic, but we are going to try and kind of consolidate it down into some key issues. And to have this conversation with me, I'm thrilled to have a specialist on the topic. So joining us is Devin Ekberg, who is a senior consultant in advisor education at PIMCO. He provides training to financial professionals on advanced wealth planning topics, including retirement strategies, alternative investments, goals-based wealth management. He joined PIMCO back in 2021 and was the Chief Learning Officer and Managing Director of Professional Development at the Investments and Wealth Institute. I actually didn't know that. He led the advisor education programs for advanced credentials in the financial industry. I personally have two of those. Devin has been in the business for 19 years, and he is a CFA charter holder and holds the Certified Investment Management Analyst and the Certified Private Wealth Advisor designations. Hi, Devin.
So do you, Jelena, I think, right?
Yes, I have both of those. I was thrilled to see that. Thank you, by the way, because I think all of these tools that you provide advisors is so tremendous. So we appreciate it.
Well, and it takes a lot of effort on your part. You're showing that you hold yourself to a higher professional standard, the higher ethical standard and the higher educational standard. So I love it. I love hearing
Thank
that.
you. Thank you. And I think to sort of tee this up, we decided to take the conversation and kind of have address four key issues. So we're going to talk about Social Security. We're going to talk about managing healthcare expenses. And then we're going to talk about estate and charitable giving and managing income, if we can get through all that. But I think before we start, Devin, I want to talk first just about longevity risk in general and retirement planning in general, just to sort of tee it up. So can you start with first, what is longevity risk? We talk about this a lot in the industry.
Yeah, I mean the really basic definition is that humans are just living longer than they have in the past. So with advances of medical technology and lifestyle and other things like that, we're just simply living longer. And there will be people who are born today that will live well into their hundreds and live well. And so that causes a lot of implications from a financial planning perspective. Everything from, the way we spend, the way we live, the way we use healthcare. There's a lot of implications to that, but that's kind of the basic idea is that we're just living longer, and that takes a lot of planning that's very different than the way my parents planned for retirement or my grandparents. It's just something that's really important to talk about.
Yeah, I agree. As much as we all know we're living longer, I think sometimes it's difficult to take that and say, okay, how does that impact a financial plan? And because a lot of times I run a financial plan and I'll tell a couple or an individual, okay, well, we have you living until age 95, and almost always they're resistant. Oh no, I'm not going to live that long, right? You must come across this all the time.
Yeah, and the surveys actually suggest that they way underestimate how long they are likely to live, and they way overestimate how expensive it is to live into those ages. And so the combination of that, it just feels like people are very unprepared because of that underestimate.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess how can individuals prepare for the financial challenges that come with the increased life expectancy?
Well, look, I would broadly just say that people need help. People need a lot of help. They need professional guidance and professional advice, and they need somebody that's objective and sort of has, the right mindset to attract a problem like this. But more specifically, like I'll give you an example. Being very intentional and thoughtful about what your spending is going to look like in retirement, right? It used to be that retirement was maybe a 10 or 15-year sort of window. You retired and that's what you expected. Now you're potentially looking at 30 years or more of your retirement life cycle. And now there's different stages within retirement, right? You've got, I've heard it referred to as kind of the go-go years, the slow go years, and the no-go
And the
years,
no-go
right?
years. Yeah.
and your spending patterns are totally different in each of those sort of phases. And so being very intentional about what your spending is going to look like in each of those phases,
Yeah.
what your lifestyle is going to look like, and what's the source of that income and that money going to be to fund those different stages. And so the modeling, like a financial advisor that's modeling those cash flows through retirement, you're doing actually a pretty sophisticated level of modeling there, that didn't used to be that way in the past.
And so for Devin, for anyone that's new to those different key areas of retirement, for example, the no-go years, that might be when you're approaching your 80s, your 90s, and you're not traveling the same way as when you're newly retired, maybe in your late 60s. Is that a great example of explaining the
That's
spending
the
habits?
total example. So the go-go years is you're doing all the things in retirement that you always dreamed to doing, traveling and on the golf course and fishing and other things like that. And you're just go going. You'll notice that your spending is actually going up in some
Yes.
cases where you're buying that RV and you're buying a new vacation home and other things like that. Your spending actually goes up.
Yeah.
And a lot of people assume it's going to go down. And then you start to slow down. As you age, the way you travel is different. The way what you prioritize is different. You may prioritize being closer to family, for instance, and so that may cause a different level of spending. And then reality catches up as you age, in those no-go years where your priorities change again. You're more interested in your legacy, and understanding how that wealth is going to transfer to the next generations, and what kind of principles and values you're looking to pass along in addition to the financial assets that you have.
Yeah. And I love that. And it's conversations that we seem to have all the time. And so with all that said, if someone is listening and they're concerned, yes, I would have different spending habits. So is it no longer expecting a 4% income off of your portfolio? What other strategies can you utilize to make sure that you're on your path for your retirement destiny?
Yeah, well, using guidelines like a 4% spending rule, and again, understanding where the sources of income come from, what type of maybe guaranteed sources of income there are available to you versus other forms of income from your portfolio assets, and maybe pensions and other things like that. So getting very specific about the source of that income, and being diversified from that income. I know we'll talk a little bit about Social Security a little bit later, but people underestimate how valuable Social Security is as a form of longevity insurance. It's one of the few things that adjusts for inflation over time. Accounts for some longevity protection, and even considers survivor benefits later on. So getting, again, very much more specific than you think you had to in terms of the sources. The idea is that, okay, my whole life I lived with a paycheck, right? Some form of kind of predictable income. And so where is that paycheck going to come from when I have to produce it with, the various sources of the income that I have? And it's getting to that question. It's different for everybody, but being very, very specific about where that's coming from.
And one last question is kind of a follow-up to all this before we get into the four key areas. You mentioned earlier, Devin, that you think the planning for retirement is very different than it's been with generations in the past. And we have now all these financial planning tools at our disposal. What is your experience with the evolution of maybe these tools that financial advisors have over time?
Well, the tools have gotten much, much better. I mean, there's the use of technology, and the math is, pretty well understood, right? It's getting the inputs of those math and those models right. Um, but and largely, besides the technical tools, which I think are great, and they're improving, and they're starting to incorporate, a more sophisticated, well, let me put it this way, a more goals-based type approach as opposed to just a mere mathematical exercise. The best advisors that I'm working with in the world are the ones that are almost kind of focused more on the mindset of retirement, understanding the behavioral adjustments that have to happen during retirement. It's very different focusing, as you're growing older and preparing for retirement, this accumulation stage, the
Yes.
math and the financial planning and the investments is all very different than the distribution phases of the
Yes.
retirement. And there's a big behavioral switch that comes to
Mhm.
that. And so advisors are almost acting more as behavioral coaches, therapists sometimes, in addition to the technical financial planning.
Yeah,
And maybe
absolutely.
you agree with that. I don't know in
No,
your
I
experience
completely
with
do. I'm
private.
actually laughing a little bit because I went through this planning last week with a new client, and she's getting used to our financial planning tools. And she sees a point where the market value of her investments drops by about 30%, about 10 years out from where we are today. And that's because we modeled market corrections. And she looked at that and she's like, what is this drop? And so again, having understanding, I guess the controlling the emotions is definitely a part of the puzzle that I think we all struggle with. So
100%. And that's really the bulk of where advisors add the most value. Again, using the tools and using the financial modeling and understanding and prioritizing goals and other things like that are critical things that advisors do. But that behavioral coaching seems to make the biggest difference from a quantifiable perspective.
yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. Thank you for going through that. So I guess let's start with the big one, Social Security. What are the key considerations when deciding when to start? I
Yeah,
think
good
that's
question.
that's that's a big question for a lot of people.
Yeah, it's confusing and it's hard. And most people sort of start out. Well, let me put it this way. Most people actually make the decision pretty naively. So about 50% of Americans claim Social Security at age 62, which is the earliest age that you can claim.
Right.
Now, they do that because for a lot of reasons, and it may be just inertia, it may just mean that they need that income, or maybe they don't understand that claiming it at age 62, which is said to be early, you're actually taking a reduction, a permanent reduction in your benefits the earlier you take it. If
Correct.
you can wait until full retirement age, which is 66 or 67, depending on when you were born, then you're said to receive your full benefits that you earned throughout your working history. And even better, if you're prepared enough to wait to claim Social Security later and up until age 70,
Yeah.
you're said to be claiming later and actually receiving an increase in your benefits, a lifetime increase in your benefits. So most people make that naively. 50% of people just claim it at age 62 for various reasons. The other 50% of Americans claim somewhere else in that range.
Hmm.
And the ones that are making the best decisions are looking at it less as a mathematical exercise, right? Mathematically speaking, it's best to wait until the latest you can claim, which is age 70.
Sure.
But the people that are doing it very thoughtfully are looking at their overall financial plan. They're making that decision in the context of their cash flow needs, their other sources of income, their portfolio income, all of those things mixed together with the proper context and making that decision, based on their specific goals and strategies and situations.
Yeah.
And that's really hard to make that decision alone with all the
Absolutely.
context that you need to make the most optimal decision. And so I always kind of just remind people that the value of professional advice in this area is unimaginable.
And I hear very often that most individuals take it the earliest they can because the comment I hear is, well, I'm not going to live very long. That's what I always hear.
I've
But
heard
then
that
going
one.
back to
And
our first, this is why we started with the longevity risk, is because we are living a lot longer than people
yeah,
are planning for.
I hear that a lot. It's not a bad reason. I mean, if you are in bad health
Yeah.
and you don't expect to live, past a certain kind of break even age, then it actually does mathematically make sense to claim it. Although people don't realize sometimes that decision should involve, like, if you have a surviving spouse
Hmm.
that may not be in bad health and may have that sort of longevity risk, your decision impacts, your surviving spouse to some degree. That might be a missing piece to it.
Yeah.
I've heard other reasons. I've heard, hey, well, look, I'm young, relatively young. I want that money now. I'm going to enjoy that money now and travel while I'm young enough to still enjoy it.
Hmm.
Or I've even heard, and you've probably heard this too from many of your clients, like, look, I just got to get my hands on this money now before the government spends it all, right?
Yeah.
Like, just the
That's another one.
system
Yeah.
itself is not reliable enough.
I
So
don't
just
trust
give me
it.
that money now. And again, those are not terrible reasons individually, but if they're made in a vacuum like that, they're more likely to be a suboptimal decision.
Okay. And two follow-up questions. One is you mentioned that break-even point, and that's something we talk a lot about as in the financial advisor community, because there are these financial planning tools that can help us evaluate what those, but can you expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, so if you do the math, the actuarial math, right, which comes from a bunch of nerds with calculators that are trying to, estimate how long you're going to live, their mortality tables. And if you do the math, you can say, look, if I claim at age X and I live until age Y, I will have received the maximum amount of benefits that I'm entitled to, right?
Mhm.
And that's going to be different for every age and every different every scenario, but it's going to land roughly for most people between age 82 and 85,
Yeah.
right? So if you plan on living past 82 or 85, waiting until you take it longer is going to maximize your sort of benefits. You're gonna win the system. You're gonna beat the math, so to
Mhm.
speak, if you live longer, than 82 to 85, depending on your situation.
Okay.
So again, it's a mathematical exercise, and I discourage people from making that. I think it's an important input in the decision,
Yes.
but I discourage people from making the decisions solely just based on that mathematics. Because, like I said before, there are people who simply need that income today to maintain their lifestyle, to maintain their happiness, to not eat cat food as opposed to other sort of lifestyle changes. So the best decision is made in the full context with a financial advisor, I think.
I think that the number for me that really stands out is the fact that 50% of Americans choose to take it as early as possible. And the fact that we're living longer to, again, going back to the beginning, there's a huge mismatch there that we are not as efficient in taking our Social Security as we could be. So,
Yeah, well, and also just the one last thing, but I think part of the reason people claim at age 62 is that's actually just how the system works. You receive a letter in the mail when you're at age 62 and says, "Hey, congratulations, you're eligible to start Social Security," right?
yes.
And it doesn't really use the language where you say if you choose it at age 62, you're sort of penalized, right? You're claiming it early and you take
Yeah,
a
they don't.
maximum reduction. They just receive a letter, says you're eligible for this, fill out a form, send it back in. And that's why I said people make that decision pretty naively,
Yeah,
is because that's how the system is sort of designed from a behavioral perspective.
absolutely.
So you almost kind of have to overcome that sort of natural inertia to make a
Yeah.
better decision.
And the last question on Social Security, because I know this comes up a lot, and I want to make sure we touch on it, is how do you answer to the individual that says, well, I just don't trust that Social Security will be around? That's a
Yeah,
hard one.
it's a really hard one. I like to say, look, we've done lots of research on this. It's possible if we don't have good leadership in Washington, and I know a lot of people don't have a lot of confidence right now in our political system,
Yeah.
it's possible that the system sort of collapses under itself, right? If no changes and no leadership are made between now and whenever that date is, right?
Mhm.
That being said, they will make changes to the program eventually to keep it sustainable, and that is going to impact participants in that program, no doubt about it.
Sure.
The people who should be really worried are kind of the younger classes.
Okay.
The people that have been contributing for a long time that are in their late 50s, 60s, maybe 70s, they're simply not going to be impacted by those changes necessarily. The
Okay.
disproportionate impact is going to be on the younger generations. And
Okay.
so with a financial advisor, if you're in my sort of age category, mid 40s, there's still things that you can do today to prepare for that eventual sort of under promised
Sure.
sort of situation,
Yeah.
right? So that's kind of the reality of it. And when we go back and look at, there's not a lot of examples of public pension systems that have completely failed like that, but there are a lot of private pension systems. And that's how it worked, was that the older participants were not impacted as much. The younger ones definitely were.
Okay. And I have yet to meet anyone in the younger generation that is planning on living off of Social Security. So I think it's mentally already, it's already been embedded in their mind. So,
Yeah, I'm probably one of them. To just be totally frank with you, I'm like I said, I still value the Social Security. I understand the value. I understand it as a piece of the overall picture. I think my mindset is that I'm just not going to simply plan for that being the only source of my income.
exactly. Yeah.
And so
Okay.
that would be my advice to some of the younger participants.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. And let's move on to healthcare expenses. This is another hot
Yes.
topic.
Yeah.
So what are the major healthcare costs that we need to plan for in retirement?
Well, just overall, if you add all of the different categories of healthcare costs, there was a study that was recently released that throughout retirement, it's estimated that you'll pay something around $350,000 cumulatively over your retirement for healthcare expenses for all the different categories.
Wow.
And if you're a higher user of health services, it could be closer to $400,000.
Hmm.
So just that's the big number to prepare for, just for as a category of spending.
Yes.
Where's that money going to come from? And there's also it's complicated too because every individual is different, their healthcare needs are different, where they live might make a
Yes.
huge difference in terms of the costs, what type of medical services they need or want or value makes a
Hmm.
big difference. Their access to employer sponsored medical services versus not, those are all factors that we should be in. I think the biggest needle that people can move, or at least the approach is to understand that there needs to be a bucket of resources that
Hmm.
is separate from other living expenses, that is specific to the healthcare situation. And I'm not even including things like long-term care and other things like that.
Right.
So that's a big adjustment for a lot of people to make. There's one other sort of mathematical dynamic that's kind of interesting in that as you age, remember in those phases of retirement, the go, no, slow go and no go years, the proportion that you pay for medical expenses out of all of your expenses increases as you go through those phases.
Yeah.
So the proportion of your income, no matter what the source, it's going to be a higher proportion of your income that's going to be going towards your medical expenses at that time.
Yeah.
So that's going to necessarily impact your spending in other areas, just proportionally, unless you're extremely wealthy and overfunded for your retirement.
Yeah.
So that's a big deal. That's a huge input that should be part of your financial planning as you think about your cash flow and spending situation.
We have been laser focused on inflation for a number of years now and its impact. And inflation is still the highest level when you look at the categories in healthcare costs, right? That hasn't changed.
It, it,
Education
it,
and healthcare.
it is. It has exceeded the standard sort of core inflation rate for the last like 2 decades or more.
Yes.
And I don't see much change structurally to change that. And
Yeah, I
so
don't
again,
either.
as you model those costs in the future, you have to take into account that accelerated inflation as
Yes.
well. Some of the interesting approaches that I'm seeing advisors, as you approach retirement, 10, 15, 20 years from now, for many of your clients, they're actually focused on getting healthier, right?
Okay.
Like, not depending on the healthcare system as much as you'd think, right? Getting your health and your metabolism and, your lifestyle changes needed,
Yes.
to not overburden a healthcare system. I think that's a really interesting approach. Certainly not something you would expect from a financial advisor, right?
Right.
Getting diet advice and
Yeah.
other things like that. But boy, I'm thinking, a financial advisor that may have, connections to resources like that, or
Absolutely.
reminding your clients that some of that is actually in your control. I think it's adding a ton of value, frankly.
Yeah.
It's something that's within our control for the large part, right? Of course, there are exceptions to that.
Yeah.
But in the face of all the other things that you can't control, like medical expenses and other things like that increasing, focusing on the things that you can control is I think, a huge value add.
That's
I
so
mean, what would
interesting.
you
And
what
there's a
would you
lot of
say with
talk
that?
today about, well,
Is,
there's a
is
lot of
that
talk
some?
today about your real age and then your health age.
Yeah, I've heard that too. It's interesting when I talk to financial advisors about this. I mean, is that something you ever thought you would incorporate into your practice eventually, like your holistic planning, where you're talking about diet and health advice in addition?
Yes. It does come up more. And you mentioned earlier that there are some individuals that have plenty in retirement. They can self-fund things like long-term care. And this is something we talk a lot about with the financial planning tools. But what other ways should individuals think about protecting themselves?
Well, there are lots of interesting studies that, in general, wealthier people live longer, and it's because they have additional resources to allocate to, medical expenses, but also, lifestyle, where they live,
Yeah.
what types of things they're doing in retirement that
Yeah.
may even extend their longevity.
They're eating.
Healthier eating, more opportunities for social development and other things like that. Those are all inputs into the quality of life. So that's maybe something to aspire to. As you think about, okay, well, what goals do I have for my wealth? Yes, I want to buy that vacation home, or I want to send my kids to college, or I want to leave that legacy. But what type of retirement do I want to have? A retirement lifestyle that I may need to overfund if I'm prioritizing things like my health and diet and social sort of interactions and things
Yeah.
like that. So,
No, I think absolutely. And I guess the last question on healthcare, but what about, can you talk a little bit about Medicare and some of the supplemental insurance and how that plays a role in managing the healthcare?
yeah, so Medicare is a reality of our U.S. financial system. You're eligible to start claiming Medicare at age 65. They're basically Medicare just kind of by itself is really hospital insurance, and then there are other sort of Medicare packages that include things like doctors and medications and other things like that. Everybody's situation is very different, but again, it's like social security in the sense that you can't really make a decision in a vacuum
Yes.
around what Medicare policies are appropriate for you. I think working with a Medicare specialist,
Yeah.
most financial advisors are not Medicare specialists, but they at least have a basic understanding of how those work. Engaging with some form of specialist to get, almost kind of as a consultant to see what plan is best for you, I think makes a lot of sense.
Absolutely.
And your next question is, well, if we talked about the state of Social Security as a system, what's the state of Medicare as a system? I'm afraid I don't have a great answer for that, other than, a lot of the policy changes that they've made in recent years have probably not been as successful as I think they were hoping that it would be. And so I
Okay.
think also planning for some form of supplemental private insurance for a lot of your clients and people that might be listening to this podcast. I think that makes a lot of sense, being open to that in addition to the Medicare services.
Okay. No, that's an important one. So thank you for going through that. And so I guess let's pivot and talk about estate and charitable giving. And when you think of an effective estate plan, what do you define as the key components?
That's a great question. So, I mean, there's a lot of benefits to estate planning. One, I mean, especially for some people, just understanding what the disposition of assets is going to be, like who receives what and how, understanding how it might impact things like estate taxes or inheritance taxes, even specific to the state that you live in.
Hmm.
Even, avoiding things like probate, if you've been through that process, you understand it's not a super fun, pleasant experience. It can be somewhat expensive. So estate planning can avoid some of the probate issues. Many families have children with special needs, or they have maybe complex blended families where you really want to be mindful of where that wealth is going to end up and to whom, and to make sure that that's organized correctly. So there's a lot of good benefits to estate planning in particular. Where I think financial advisors can add a lot of value is understanding, what those people's goals actually are. And I'll give you a little bit of a hint. The financial assets are kind of at the bottom of the list, frankly, and the easiest to manage in the things that people want to transfer. When we ask people what they're more concerned about, it's transferring things that we talked about earlier, like transferring values and
Yes.
principles and intellectual capital and the mindset of these families that created some form of wealth and the character it took to create that wealth. They want to make sure that the next generations receive that in
Yes.
addition to the wealth that they actually provided.
Yes.
People don't really have those conversations anymore. I don't know if you agree with that or not. My theory is that we used to depend a lot on like institutions to help us have those conversations, like churches and community
Yes,
groups. And
absolutely.
membership associations and things like that. And membership in those kind of organizations are down across the board. And so we miss out on a lot of those opportunities to have those conversations, to express values to the next generations,
Hmm.
and then actually hear those values expressed back to you
Yes.
from those generations. So being mindful of that
Hmm.
is actually should be the first step, frankly. And once you have a good handle on that communication between those generations of what this wealth is supposed to mean and what we're supposed to do with it, the financial planning actually becomes a lot easier
Yeah.
in support of those type of almost kind of more spiritual objectives that families have. I don't know.
Yeah,
Would
I
you
think
agree with that or not? Or do you?
I totally do. And I think that there's so many individuals that are reluctant to get their children involved, even the adult children, in the conversation. And I don't know if it's a generational thing or what, but we have this conversation all the time about trying to include the next generation in the conversations. And there's a lot of hesitancy, I think, still overall. I'm laughing because I'm watching Yellowstone right now. We have all these amazing shows that talk about this succession and what a disaster it can be, right?
Oh, and there are plenty of examples of just massive disasters. And you're right. When I've worked with clients individually, I hear some hesitation.
Mhm.
It's like, okay, well, I don't want to share all like the entire household balance sheet and all these numbers, and it's
Sure.
almost kind of none of their business,
Right.
frankly. And they think that it might cause additional issues or tension that they have to deal with. But I'm here to tell
Yes.
you, man, that stuff's going to happen anyway,
Yeah.
right? You're going to have every family is dysfunctional. I promise you.
Yes.
Um, and so it's either dealing with that dysfunction during your lifetime or allowing that dysfunction to occur after your death. And in my own family situation with both my parents having passed away, we're grateful that they did some level of estate planning,
Okay.
but they could have done, I think, a much better job potentially. And they were hesitant to discuss things with their kids, and so it was left to us to kind of try to figure out what they wanted or not
Yeah.
because it wasn't talked about.
Well,
So
and
those
I think part of
conversations
it
have to
too is
happen.
every child is different, right? When you look at all the family dynamics, some children may be
Yep.
more responsible than others, some more emotional than others, some that want to get more involved, and that just adds to the dynamic of how these parents want to handle their assets. So,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah, when we've worked with very wealthy families, what's really interesting is that the ones that are very intentional about discussing their wealth with their next kids are definitely the most successful in terms of getting that transfer,
mhm,
smoothly. But what's interesting is the families that focus on the why of the wealth, right?
yeah,
Why this wealth even exists in the first place, why it was created, what we want to do with this wealth, what's the purpose of this wealth, and what we want our kids and grandkids to do with this wealth. When they have that really strong conversation about the why, the how becomes easier, right?
yes,
There's all sorts of, trusts, planning, other forms of language that you can use in that estate plan to help facilitate that why.
mhm,
And if there are disagreements, let it be on the how, right?
yep,
Those are easy to actually resolve, right? Just
yep,
functionally. But if there's a different disagreement on the why, those are where the big dysfunctional, like the Yellowstone families, they have a big disagreement on the why,
exactly,
and those are almost unsolvable, and that's where you get into big issues.
yes,
So be very clear and aligned on the why this wealth exists,
mhm.
and if there's going to be a disagreement, let it be on the how it's administered, because again, those are easier to resolve.
Yeah, and Devin, yet again, you're taking it back to the behavioral finance, the emotions, right? That's where it kind of all stems
Yeah.
from, and uh,
So not only are you a financial advisor, you're now a therapist in
yeah,
some ways. You're like a behavioral scientist where you're trying to
yeah,
figure out, the family dynamics of some of the families that you're working with,
yeah.
in addition to being like a health coach and a dietitian and all those things. So you're not charging your clients
I
enough.
know. So talking about the values, and we're very fortunate at our firm because we have a lot of charitably inclined clients. But can you just briefly go through how you think incorporating charitable giving can bring value to the estate plan?
Yeah, yeah, and that word you use, being intentional about it, is what it's about. So In 2024, Americans are forecasted to give about $550 billion in charitable giving to 501(c)(3) organizations. I mean, that's huge. And
Yeah.
I think, and that number's just been growing. I think COVID, the pandemic kind of opened up a lot of people's eyes to the needs around the communities that they have. And Americans are very generous. But what we find is people give charitably again, in kind of a naive way,
Hmm.
right? They'll go to a fundraiser, they'll go to their church, they're very generous, they'll raise a paddle, they'll commit to fundraising, they'll write a check, and they don't realize that there are other ways of giving that may actually, even though it's not the purpose behind their giving, but there may be some tax savings potentially that they could use. They could maybe
Yes.
use appreciated securities instead of cash, for instance, or to save themselves the capital gains of liquidating their investments and then giving it to the charity.
Yeah.
Let's give them the investments, let the charity liquidate them with no tax issues, and save yourself some tax issues. Now, you can do this in a very basic way
Hmm.
with direct gifts. You can be a little bit more sophisticated and use things like donor advised funds. I
Yes.
don't know if you or your firm uses those, but
Heavily. Yeah.
we're using it. We're seeing a huge interest in that, and we can talk about that more if you want.
Yeah.
We're seeing some of the wealthier families still go the direction of kind of maybe using like split interest trust vehicles like charitable remainder trusts and things like that,
Yeah.
or even going, private foundation. But more and more I'm seeing just using kind of some of the easy use tools like the donor advised funds, even for very large gifts.
Yes.
And that allows you to control the timing of your gift, receive your charitable deduction in the year that is maximizing the benefit to you, and then you still get to control the timing of the disposition of those assets to your charity. So understanding how that giving,
Mm.
the timing and the amounts, potential tax savings that can result as the deductions that are available for that giving,
Yeah.
and then timing it with your client's tax situation can add a ton of value.
I
So by
agree.
the way, now if you're racking up the list of things you're doing, now you're like a tax advisor. And I don't want you to say you're a tax advisor. That's usually not a good idea, but maybe a tax educator,
Yes.
and helping people realize how they can maximize those deductions in the years that make the most sense.
Yeah.
Understanding, where your client's tax bracket is. Maybe there are years where you have more income or less income. And so timing your charitable distributions for those years to maximize that makes a ton of sense.
I think it makes a ton of sense. Yeah. And
Um,
to your point, the donor advised fund, it doesn't have the cost behind. A lot of individuals think, oh, well, to have these accounts set up for charitable giving, it costs a lot of money to set up an endowment. But these are very I think of it like a 529, but for the charitable giving world.
yeah, that's a great
Right.
analogy. I really like that. And these funds these days, they're usually pretty low cost, or at least
Yeah.
there are several low cost options. And that doesn't mean that your investment options within there are limited. There's some
No.
funds that have some great investment options. Some of them, and many of them now, are able to receive complex gifts like business interests and other things like that, with valuation discounts and illiquidity discounts, things like that. So there's no reason why those can't be used
Yes, absolutely.
in many ways.
Yeah.
So
No, that's great. Thank you. Thank you for bringing that one up. I guess the last one is this is probably one of my favorite is the managing the income in retirement.
mhm.
And let me start, Devin. I was reading a few weeks ago an article from I think Northwestern where they said the average American today thinks they need 1.4 million to live in retirement. We've already talked about how different and unique everyone's circumstances are, but I know to a lot listening, it sounds like a ton. And then I also am thinking back to what did you say? The average American will spend 350,000 in healthcare costs. So there goes a third of it. So I guess, can you talk a little bit about, let's talk a little bit about first about the income sources that you can utilize while you're in retirement.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so if you're fortunate enough to have, reliable sort of paycheck income, like a pension, Social Security, of course, would be in that. Maybe you have guaranteed income from some form of annuity or other things like that. That's a great start. Those are good bases. But for most people, they're going to have to rely on some form of portfolio income.
Mhm.
Having accumulated some assets moving forward, you've got to find the right balance between risk and reward. Now, a generation ago, when you hit retirement, the idea was it's like, oh, I don't want to take any risk in my portfolio at all. I'm going to put it all into like a fixed income, like a bond portfolio. It's relatively safe. It'll give me coupon interest.
Mhm.
I don't know if we live in that world anymore. I think as we live longer, and we need more sort of risk within the portfolio to generate those returns, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of one of those laws of the universe to generate higher returns for a longer period of time. You probably have to take a higher risk within the portfolio, not unsophisticated risk, but maybe a little higher level of risk. So now
Mhm.
you've got potentially a higher level of, say, like risk assets like stocks or alternative investments, things like that within a portfolio. So you're going to need a little bit more sophisticated portfolio management
Mhm.
to make sure that you're balancing that now new risk, that
Yes.
higher level of risk potentially, with the returns in the portfolio, and then deciding how to convert the returns in your portfolio into the actual income that you need. Now,
Mhm.
you mentioned there's a 4% guideline, right?
Yes.
Withdrawing 4%. They call it a 4% rule. I
Yes.
don't know if that's a rule or not. A guideline.
Yeah.
It's been challenged academically a little bit.
It has. Yeah, it's come up a lot.
But being flexible is actually, I think, more important. So if you use 4% withdrawal rate from your portfolio, the chances of you running out of portfolio income under a lot of different scenarios is relatively small.
Mhm.
But you can even change that dynamically and say,
Yes.
look, in years where my portfolio actually does very well, maybe I can afford to take a little bit more income from that area. And in years where they're not performing very well, maybe I choose to take, the 4% or less.
Yes.
You can adjust and kind of create some guardrails depending on inflation, depending on returns. The one big risk in portfolio management in retirement is something called sequence of returns risk. You're probably familiar with that because I know we taught you that in those designation programs,
Hmm.
where the risk of having real bad, big negative returns in your portfolio early on in your retirement, so like as you transition into retirement, if you have bad performance in those few years at the beginning, that can actually impact the whole 30 years of your portfolio performance going forward. And so being mindful that protecting those first few years of your portfolio performance is actually critical. And
Hmm.
there's a number of financial planning strategies that can help address that. So
Yeah.
it's not a simple kind of set it and forget it sort of portfolio approach that it maybe used to be in the past. You've got to be a little bit more sophisticated on your portfolio management. But
Hmm.
the fortunate thing is that those tools exist,
Yeah.
um, and the ability for people to take on maybe a little bit more risk within retirement in a smart way
Hmm.
can solve a lot of those longevity issues going forward.
Yeah. And I think to your point, Devin, there's so many different strategies. And I think sticking to a strategy that makes sense is key. And I'm saying this because I had a conversation last week with a client. We've consistently been taking out a steady income from the portfolio. But if you look at the returns over the last year, we're in double digit returns in a balanced portfolio. And his comment was, hey, Jelena, I can take a little bit more out now. And exactly to your point, I said, you can, but when the market goes down, which it will at some point, I'm going to ask you to do the opposite. And he's like, oh, I don't want to do
Right.
that.
Right.
So I think sometimes there's a little bit of sort of hand holding because it does get emotional. You get excited when the markets are up, or you're like, oh, I've got more flexibility. But I think you have to find the discipline that works for you and make sure you maintain
Yeah.
it.
But that is, yeah, and that's a perfect example. And I've definitely heard that one before. But what I found is most people are pretty receptive to that idea. They're sort of used to that idea if you think about it. Like, they spent their whole lives accumulating this wealth, through their paychecks or their business or whatever. And they've always kind of instinctively understood that During good times,
Yeah.
yeah, give yourself permission to spend a little bit more, but in bad times, kind of maybe pull it back a little bit within reason, right? Without, adjusting your lifestyle so dramatically. So it's small changes in the portfolio plan over time that really add the value. And then talking people out of really big drastic changes, that are
Yes.
many times motivated by fear or anxiety. Like, oh my God, we're in a recession. I got to sell my house. I got to quit my job. I got to do all these big drastic changes.
It's an election year.
Or election year, and there's always going to be
There's
something. There's
always a reason.
geopolitics or inflation or
Yeah.
uh, you know, my wife reminded me that Mercury is in retrograde or something. I don't know. There's always something, right? And so talking out of those big drastic changes is often
Mhm.
the right thing to do.
Well, and I guess the last question for you on the retirement side, Devin, is you mentioned earlier taxes. And taxes have a huge implication in retirement as well, depending on kind of, I always say what buckets you own,
Right.
right? Where are you pulling this money that you need? Is it from a taxable account, a retirement account? Can you walk through that real quick?
Yeah, yeah. Well, there's, there are tax efficient investments. There are tax efficient sort of accounts. A
Hmm.
lot of that tax planning kind of had to be done 10, 15 years ago to kind of get the right maximum things, but there's never a wrong time to start thinking about taxation.
Hmm.
So understanding where you are. So I'll give you one example, and there's millions of these, but so as you approach retirement, you often have these tax advantaged, like a 401k or IRA or whatnot, and there's a tax liability that's embedded in those types of accounts. And when you retire, let's say at age 65,
Hmm.
and before you start claiming Social Security or before you start claiming your pension income, things like that, your income is temporarily lower than it maybe used to be during your highest professionally earning, time in your career.
Right.
So a lot of people will use that dip in their income to start. Maybe they'll do some Roth conversions, for instance, right? They'll take some of the tax deferred accounts, transfer that to a Roth account, pay the taxes on it now while your income is low and you're
Yeah.
filling up your lower marginal tax brackets, so that when your retirement income comes in later and you're in a higher marginal tax bracket, you've saved some of that area. So being intentional about the transition period and where your income is now, where you can save those taxes. That's one example.
Yeah, absolutely.
A second example might be something called like asset location.
Hmm.
You've heard of asset allocation, but asset location matters a lot. There are some types of investments like stocks that are relatively, tax efficient, compared to other investments like bonds that are, traditionally less tax efficient. And so making sure that you have stocks in the right account and bonds in the right account. Your advisor can help place those investments in the right vehicles
Hmm.
to save some of that taxation.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm
And
also
there's a
thinking
million
of,
other examples that way.
well, I'm also thinking of, ETFs versus maybe an active mutual fund where the manager is generating return, but actively selling and buying investments, which are creating more of a tax consequence,
Yeah, that's
right?
exactly right. And that may still be the right investment vehicle,
Hmm.
but just making sure that it's placed in a tax advantaged account where
Yes.
your taxable account maybe has more ETFs, like you mentioned, that are a little bit more tax favorable structure for the investment
Yes,
in the taxable account. So you get the benefit of that. And
absolutely.
then, to the degree that it's appropriate to have maybe the mutual fund instead, putting it in the appropriate account makes sense too.
Know what you own
Know what you own and where it's owned.
and
That's
where it
exactly.
is. Absolutely. So asset location, that's a huge one. So all right, we hit the four that we wanted to talk about today. Are there any common misconceptions about retirement planning that you think the listener should be aware of?
Yeah, the big one that I come across a lot is that people treat retirement planning the same way as just kind of traditional financial planning.
Mm.
But I think that's a mistake because traditional financial planning is much more focused on the accumulation phases, right? And that's a very different mindset than the retirement phase. And so treating the financial plan in retirement differently because there's so many different components to it, different inputs to it, different mindset to it.
Hmm.
Big mistake is to just treat it the same way you have through your whole life. That's maybe one. Number two is I think people don't allow themselves to really think about what retirement looks like to them, right?
Yeah.
They had something in their mind through their whole life, like, okay, I'm gonna retire, I'm gonna live on a golf course, and I'm gonna go fishing, right? And a lot of people 5 years into that realize that's not what's going to fulfill them, right? They're driving their spouse crazy being at home. They're not focused on anything else. They're not fulfilled in retirement
Yeah.
because they didn't allow themselves to dream about what their retirement should or could look like, and they didn't prepare for it.
Yeah, they didn't prepare.
So allow yourself to dream and think about it in vivid detail what you want with your retirement. Of course, circumstances change, things change.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what I hear most people refer back to whenever they talk about retirement, they always talk about it in terms of their family, right? I want to spend more time with the family. I want to move closer to my kids or grandkids. So retirement's not just an individual activity, like an individual thing for me. It's a household exercise. What's that going to mean for me, but also my spouse, my kids, my future grandkids, things like that.
Yeah.
It's not just an individual exercise. It is a household exercise. And so allow yourself to dream, what that actually looks like, and then plan ahead for it.
Yeah. I love that point. Thank you. And I guess last question, and I feel like this is a little bit leading, but I'm going to go with it anyways. But how can individuals personalize their retirement plans to fit their unique circumstances?
Well, I think I've said it a number of times today already, but just work with a financial advisor that you trust. Make sure that you're fully vulnerable with your financial advisor, right? Even talking about those things that might even be uncomfortable to you, all that spiritual stuff I was talking about earlier, that stuff matters. But being open and willing to take the professional advice from a good advisor is absolutely critical. And then number two is, again, it's not always about optimizing your wealth.
No.
And that sounds strange because that's what we do for a living. That's the reason we got into the business in the first place, is to optimize your wealth on paper. But it's more about optimizing your life with your wealth.
Yeah.
And that's a key difference. You think about it in those terms, you're likely to make different decisions with your financial plan than just simply optimizing the math.
Absolutely.
So those, just off the top of my head there.
No, that's a great point. I mean, we have conversations with clients all the time that are like, what if I could retire earlier? What would that look like? Again, they're not trying to optimize their wealth. They're just trying to see if they can live off of what they've accumulated comfortably, if that were the case, which I think it's an exercise we do all the time. So
what an outstanding question. Really, as a thought exercise, it's an outstanding question to ask.
And I guess I'm going to cheat. One more question, Devin. But for those that have not worked with a financial advisor, that maybe don't know the right questions to ask if they're talking to one, what would some of those questions look like if they're trying to approach an advisor to make sure that they are doing what we're talking about, which is, helping them build these effective financial plans, retirement plans that are unique to their circumstances?
Yeah, that's a great question. I like to use, there's a little bit of a rhetorical sort of structure that I like to use to ask these questions. And the abbreviation for it is OPA, OPA. Okay. So stay with me here, but O stands for outcome. But that's what you're going to be asking, is like, not what are your goals, right? Goals are different than outcomes, but what are the outcomes that you are looking for? What does your retirement look like? What is, who are you with? Where do you live? What activities are you doing? What does your lifestyle look like? What are the outcomes that you're looking for in retirement? And again, be mindful of the different stages in retirement and your longevity, right? But help people develop a picture for this as the outcomes, right? Number one. The second letter is purpose. Okay. And I mentioned that earlier, like, what's the why behind this wealth? It's really important not to just conceptualize the outcomes that you want, but why? Why does this matter? What's important? And what you're listening for is, well, what are the priorities here, right? If I had to, if I can't have everything, so what would I prioritize here? That's what you're going to get from the why. A lot of people skip that part, by the way.
Yeah. They
start talking about their goals, and then they're like, okay, let's start talking about an action plan here and get the tactics and the financial plan and all that stuff. They skip the why part. But man, that's a really fulfilling, rewarding conversation to have about the why.
Okay.
I had clients in tears talking about the why behind they want those outcomes, right?
Yeah.
So O, P, and then A is what it sounds like. It's the action plan.
Action.
It's the financial plan,
Yeah.
and taking into account those priorities that you've talked about, being realistic about the resources that you have today, and ultimately what that will look like in the future as well. And you may be constrained financially to do all the things that you want to do. Maybe you're actually well overfunded for what you can do, and your financial plan will differ depending on whether you're constrained or overfunded or whatnot.
Mhm.
But developing that action plan, but only after you've gotten really clear on the outcomes, you get really clear on the why and the purpose behind it, then the action plan becomes easier to
Put it into
conceptualize.
action. Okay, I love it. Well, because so many people don't know how to ask they don't know what questions to ask. It's always, well, what's your fee? And then and then it just kind of falls apart from there, you know?
Yeah, well,
They don't know what else to
the fee is
ask.
hard. Yeah, the fee is hard, but I think
And I don't want to suggest that's a bad question, but I think to
no,
your
no, it's not a
point,
bad question. It's
yeah,
it's the right question.
yeah,
But a lot of people raise the question of fees. Again, maybe they don't appreciate again the value of professional advice. And not just for a financial advisor, but for like a medical doctor or a
sure.
CPA or other type of professional. And it's often because they don't really see the value yet. Like the cost is sort of abstract in the absence of value. And
Absolutely.
so it's a discussion to be had. Like, is this valuable for you? What does the value look like? What does that cost? Maybe the right question is to invert that question and say, well, what is the cost of not having the financial advice potentially? The difference between, meeting this outcome or this goal or not,
We're not.
and maybe what are the mistakes that I'm going to make doing it myself, that a financial advisor can change for me. And by the way, this is just, I'll make one last point. This is the reason why I myself work with a financial advisor.
Mhm.
Now, this is my background, right? Security analysis, portfolio management.
Yeah.
I'm good at. I've got a lot of plaques on my wall that say I'm good at it. But I see the value of having objective advice.
Yes.
And again, making mistakes because I view things myopically, by human nature, and
Sure.
having somebody there to hold me accountable and to have those conversations that I care about, like the values and principles, in addition to the financial plan. So that's why I work with a financial advisor myself. So.
No, thank you for sharing that. I completely agree. There's a lot of moving parts around this discussion of retirement planning, and hopefully we were able to address just a few of them today, but I think there's some of the more important ones. So, Devin, is there information on PIMCO's website for clients if they want to learn more?
A little bit.
Okay.
It's going to be very investment oriented. So PIMCO is an asset manager. They manage a lot of mutual funds, specifically around income and interest, like bonds, fixed income, things like that. And so
Yes.
you're going to see a lot of opinions and education about how bonds are a part of a portfolio, what role they might play in retirement income, things like that. You'll find a lot of resources there.
And they are great resources, so
There's a lot of smart people there, and they have some interesting things to say because they are focused heavily on this sort of aspect of portfolio management. So
okay. No, that's great. Thank you. Devin, thank you for all of the conversation today. It is so insightful. I appreciate so much what you have done for the industry. We appreciate what PIMCO is doing as well with the resources that you offer the financial advisor community.
well, thank you so much. This is a fun thing for me to talk about, and I love that you're focused on it and you're providing these resources for your clients and other people who are maybe considering working with you or considering just working with a financial advisor. I get to work with a lot of advisors, and some get it and some don't. And it's clear by your questions and your approach that you're one of those that get it. So I
Oh,
really
thank
appreciate
you.
being here.
Well, IWI has been so impactful for me. And so again, I appreciate all of the effort that you made there. I'm still very involved with them. So I'm continuing every day to learn more. So thank you.
I'm glad to hear it. Thanks so much.